So, yes, thank you so much, Piyali, for coming and actually joining me for this because I really appreciate it. It's pretty awesome to talk to you again after all these years, you know. So it's
My honor to be here. I'm so thrilled that this is a series that you're doing. And, the last time we saw each other was over 10 years ago at SOAS when you were an undergrad and I was a graduate student. And we came together via the Women's Center. And I'm so glad we did. And I'm so glad both of us are still talking about women.
There you go. It's meant to be kismet that we just came back together again because it's such an awesome book that you've written, and I'm so excited. So I'm going to do a brief introduction and then go straight into it. So yes, so Piyali Bhattacharya is a writer, editor, and professor of creative writing. Her short stories and essays have appeared in Literary Hub, New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and many, many more places. Is quite incredible. And she's also the editor of the anthology Good Girls Marry Doctors, South Asian American Daughters on Obedience and Rebellion. Now, obviously, this book has been just lauded, which is incredible, and it's been awarded gold medals from the Independent Publisher Book Award and the Next Generation Indie Book Award, in addition to also receiving a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and also crazy and so amazing being named an Asian American Literary Achievement of 2016 by NBC. Now, Piyali holds an M.F.A, so she's an absolute whiz from the University of Wisconsin Madison, where she was also the winner of the Peter Straub Award for fiction, and she's currently a writer in residence at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's currently teaching nonfiction and fiction in the creative writing program. So, what a absolute powerhouse! So, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. It's really my honor to be here. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so glad that we are continuing this discussion that we started over 10 years ago as students. This is wonderful.
I know, it's so crazy. I just can't believe that here we are again, full circle, doing this and talking about your incredible book, which is, yeah. And first of all, I've got to ask, obviously, I know you from the perspective of working in the sort of feminist sort of arena, but what inspired you to write this book?
I'm so glad you asked that. And I'm so glad that you and I are having this particular conversation because, of course, one of the things that is evident from the title of the book is that it's the perspectives of South Asian American women and femmes. Of course, one of the interesting things is that the inspiration for this book happened not in the United States. It happened in the UK when I was at SOAS. And so I'm particularly interested to be talking. I'm not sure if you specifically identify as British. I'm going to go ahead and assume that you do. And so because of that, I think it's super interesting to be having this particular conversation with a South Asian with a South Asian British woman
Yeah.
as a South Asian American woman. They are one of the things I say to my students all the time is that the word Asian means very, very different things in the US and the UK. When we say the
Mm,
word Asian in the US, we are almost consistently meaning East Asian. When we say the word
yeah.
Asian in the UK, we are almost consistently meaning South Asian.
So true.
So this conversation in and of itself, just between you and me as individuals and how we identify, is a really interesting one. Having said all of that, to answer your specific question, which is where the inspiration of this book came from, it came from the fact that while I was at SOAS, actually, which is a college under the umbrella of the University of London, first of all, I had wanted to go to the University of London specifically because I knew that there was going to be such a multiplicity of South Asian diaspora
Mm,
there. That was one of my main reasons for wanting to go to SOAS. And when I got there, I wasn't wrong. One of the most amazing things about being at SOAS was that I met so many different kinds of Asians from so many different kinds of
mm,
diasporas. And having grown up in the United States, being in the UK, which is, of course, itself a home for so many diasporas, but is also the kind of stomping grounds for many other kinds of diasporas to
mm,
walk through, was a real inspiration. And I think being in London and having so many conversations with so many Asian Americans, so many Asian British people, so many Asians who are from so many other diasporas, Asian Australians, Asian Middle
mm.
Easterns. I mean, it was just a real multiplicity of Asianness that I came across in the UK, and I think that those conversations at SOAS really led me to start thinking, okay, what is it about um, being of a female of the South Asian diaspora that is such a specific experience?
Mm.
When I started the book, I knew I had to limit it to the South Asian American experience because um, writing creating an anthology around a South Asian diasporic experience that it spans the whole globe would have been a very tricky ordeal. But I think that the inspiration for it came from being in London and talking to so many different kinds of Asian diasporic people.
That's so cool. I didn't even realize that. That's really interesting. And you're right, we're kind of spoilt in the UK in terms of having such a wide variety of sort of South Asian people from right across the globe in one hub. We definitely have a lot of like true multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism in London, especially. So
Absolutely, and especially for South Asians, right? I think that one of the things that was so fascinating to me about the UK was that growing up in the US, nobody knew what I was. Like this, I was just a total mystery to people. I mean, this brown skin was a real like anomaly for most people, and if anybody had to guess what my ethnicity might be, the consistent guesses were all in the realm of Hispanic, Latinx,
ah.
Brazilian. Like these are the guesses that those of us who are South Asian often get in the U.S. Whereas when I was in London, everybody knew I was South Asian. Like that, just like, and they what they didn't know was that I was American. That was the part that I had to explain. But they knew from looking at me that I was South Asian, and that was such an amazing source of strength to me. And that was something that I hadn't ever experienced before. It was really quite amazing.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, and actually, that does make sense. Actually, when you think about it, because you're right, because it's identified so differently in the US. And so, I wanted to ask you. So, what does a good South Asian American girl mean to you?
Oh man. I think that I will answer your question with a very frustrating answer, which is that I don't believe that that term exists.
Yeah,
I don't believe in that term. I don't believe in South Asian American goodness. There is no such thing. And to try and fit ourselves into something that would be considered South Asian American goodness is in itself a failed experiment.
yeah.
Because to ask somebody to be good, everybody's definition of good has to be their own. And
Mm,
I think the whole point of the book is to say that the kind of cultural norms of goodness that have been pressed onto us, we reject those definitions. We reject the definitions of what is goodness for women. We reject the definition of what is goodness for South Asians. We reject the definition of what is goodness for brown women. Um, and we are making our own definitions of that.
absolutely. No, that makes total sense. I was just wondering what you'd say for that, actually. So, it was a bit of a test, wasn't it? And actually, I was just wondering, like, because obviously, you get to share your own story in this book, and I was just wondering, how did it feel to actually share your own story in this?
I think that that was hard. I think that being the convener of these stories was a real and true privilege. And I think when I set out to do this project, I hadn't fully understood what a tremendous honor and also how much weight that would mean
Mm,
carrying. And I think that for a long time, I was so busy holding weight for other people that I sort of didn't think much about why I had come to this project in the first place, which was my own story.
mm.
Um, and it was a difficult thing to do. And I think that I took a lot of solace from a lot of my people who ended up becoming my dear friends who ended up writing for the volume. They were being so brave in sharing their stories that's what gave me the inspiration to share mine.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, was it quite a sort of emotional experience, like actually compiling those stories and just sort of? seeing all of their thoughts, really.
It was extraordinarily emotional. I would say that that part was far more emotional than telling my own story. My own story is interesting, but I would say that maybe part of the reason why I wanted to create this anthology is that my life, it turns out, is far less interesting than most of my friends, and so
I'm
um,
not sure about that. It's pretty pretty interesting to me.
no, but you know what's so interesting is that when I started talking to other women and femmes about what their experience had been, um, the kinds of stories that they started sharing with me, and we did most of this over the phone,
Wow.
because the people who were writing for this volume were not people I had ever met before.
No.
Before, these were not just like my friends that I had rounded up. These were writers who had responded to a call to write for this volume, and so often they were not people I knew. And so, I
Mm.
mean, they 100% were not people I knew nearly. And so, so when we would chat on the phone, we would talk about, okay, so what made you respond to this call? Like, why do you want to write for this volume? Um, and they would share these extraordinary life stories, and it was so emotional. And choosing just
Mm.
one story to tell for each of them out of the many stories they each told me,
Oh, wow.
was really emotional. It was really beautiful.
Yeah, and actually, I was wondering, how did you then pick the stories in the end?
Out of those phone conversations, which were really emotional and which usually left both of us, both me and the contributor, very, very raw, um, there was almost always one moment where the contributor was like, well, and then this happened, but that's not really important. So I'm just going to gloss over that. And almost every time I would be like, I feel like that's the thing your essay should be about. The thing you don't want to talk about is probably the thing your essay should be about. Um, and that's a really difficult thing to say. It's a really difficult thing to hear as a writer. And
Mm.
it's also almost always true.
So true. And yeah, difficult experience. And like, there's so many amazing stories in the book. Sorry, essays, I would say. And I was just wondering, were there any in particular that really struck a chord with you?
I think that more than striking a chord with me, the most incredible thing has been to see what has struck a chord with readers in the years
Mm.
that the book has been out. Um, and it's really so many the things I should say that like when I first started doing this project, many people um, assumed that the kinds of essays I would receive and personal narratives I would receive for this project would be of two kinds. One, my parents dislike my partner based on their race or gender. Two, my parents dislike my career based on how successful or not I am in it. Those are the two kinds of stories that everybody assumed were going to show up in these essays. And what truly, and I'm embarrassed to say that what truly shocked even me was that when we got the submissions in, they were so varied. I mean, they were just across the board. And I shamed myself because I was thinking, right, we are as varied a community as any other community. We deserve to have as a rainbow of stories, just like any other community would have. And there are stories in here about financial distress. There are stories in here about sort of generational trauma. There are stories in here about generational joy. There are stories in here that are funny. There are stories in here that are wacky. Like, I think that's the part that has been so extraordinary, is to see like us as a very vibrant, very diverse community on the page, and to watch readers relate to all the essays in totally different ways. So the essays I related to were not essays that other readers related to, were not
Yeah.
essays that other readers related to. It was really this kind of amazing, foray into, wow, what a tremendously complicated and large diaspora we really are.
Yeah, no, completely. And that's definitely what I found reading the book as well, which is just such a vast array of talent and just amazing writers right across the board. We have actors, lawyers, just lots of sort of variations in
Mhm.
people, which I loved. It really did kind of, as you say, sort of showcase our stories in such a
Yeah.
wonderful way. And for you, like, what was it like for you to straddle these two, massively different cultures? You could say.
Yeah, I think that again, I'm going to give you a frustrating response, which is something that I also ask of my students, which is that what do we mean when we say the word culture? You
Hmm.
know, like that. I think that to me, this narrative of I'm from two different cultures, um, it fit something when I was growing up in the 90s and 2000s in New York. And that was a very sort of simplistic way for me to understand what it was that I was going through. And I was the first
Hmm.
generation of my family to go through that. But as I've grown older, I've really just been questioning what is culture? Like, what do we even mean when we say that? Um, like the most primitive definition, the definition that I was given as I was growing up as a brown person in a white area, um, was that Eastern culture is
Hmm.
is sort of respectful and deferential, and that Western culture is kind of individualistic and like is obsessed with notions of freedom, like this kind of thing. Um,
Hmm.
and I find both of those definitions to be so reductive and useless. Um, Neither of those things are true. Like the thing that has been so clear in recent years is that rape culture is a part of both cultures.
Yes.
Racist culture is a part of both cultures. Like these are things that are universally true. And so to sort of give definitions of what Eastern and Western culture is, I'll take it a step further. What is culture? Also, what is East and West? This is something I
Yeah.
say to my students all the time. Like, cardinal directions do not exist in outer space.
Hmm.
We decided to read a map from left to right because that's how we read English, because it was people who spoke English who colonized most of the world. But to say that East and West, to even define something as being in the realm of East or West, is in itself an imperialist practice. And
Hmm.
so, like, I mean, so essentially, like, nearly any question you can ask me, I can, but the answer almost always, unfortunately, is that I reject the premise. So yeah, I think that to be a part of, then let's say, a multiplicity of cultures,
Hmm.
um, is to have to code switch, right? And is to have
Yes.
to make sure that one is able to be legible in whatever space physically they are in. That I think is the bigger question for me, and I think is something that the book is really contending with. A lot of the contributors to the book are really contending with what it means to be legible in that moment,
Hmm.
to this person, to this space, to that space. Um, how do we make ourselves legible but also seen? Because it's very easy to make ourselves legible in a way that hides us, but how do we make
Hmm.
ourselves legible in a way that we are also seen?
No, you're totally right about that in terms of the cultural aspect because technically, as soon as you go into a new country, you basically create a new culture.
Right.
It's an evolution. So, yeah, and it does make sense that it's a bit of a strange word, and we still have obviously lots of issues we have to contend with in terms of things like I remember us discussing it at the time, which was like honor crimes and things like that,
Yeah.
which used a lot of that premise of East and West cultures, which was very problematic.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. And in your own situation, like it was quite interesting reading the book, obviously, because there was a sort of a lot of themes related to sort of having choices, and in your own situation, like it was interesting because would you say you lacked any choices at all because actually on the one hand you had lots and then on the other hand there was a bit of a restriction.
I think that the condition of identifying as female is to be in the condition of lacking choices.
Mm.
That there is no woman or femme or non binary person on earth who would say that they have an abundance of choices. That's
Mm.
just the truth. Um, so I think that, and this comes back to your questions about definition of goodness, right? Like, if one wants to be considered any type of good in any culture, in any society, in any part of planet Earth, and one is also female, one lacks choices.
Mm.
There are only a couple of choices available to those seeking to be both female and some sort of ridiculous definition of good. Um, so that alone, I would say, is something that I think about a lot. Um, and yeah, and then the other part of that is thinking about the fact that, and I think about this a lot, particularly, and this is where the American context is really important to this book, and I think this would be a bit different in the UK, but in the United States, many Asian families post the Immigration Act of 1965 came to the U.S. as skilled laborers,
Mm.
and as a result, what that means is that the majority of our Asian population in the US, our visible Asian populations in the US, are part of something we would call the model minority.
Mm.
And what that means is that they were, it doesn't mean that they didn't face racism or hardship or extreme financial distress or any of those things. But what it means is that the people who were invited to this country came to this country having already been born of a certain kind of privilege. They came to this country, one of the sort of big jokes around brown families is like, oh, my dad came to this country with $5 in his pocket. Maybe he did. He also had an MD. Like that is that's one of my sort of counters to that joke is that, like, all our parents came, especially those of us who are first generation Americans. All our parents came to this country with very little, and yet many of them came to this country also with a lot. And so
Mm.
I think that for me, to think about choice is to think about the fact that I come from a privileged tradition in South Asia, and
Mm.
that privilege is what allowed my immigrant parents to immigrate,
Yeah.
and that privilege continues to allow me to have a certain amount of choice in my life, and that is something I really need to contend with. My set of choices as a woman are really constrained, and my set of choices as the descendants of my family are not necessarily very constrained. And
Hmm.
those are things that I grapple with a lot.
Right. Okay. So in that case, do you believe some level of disobedience is necessary, and why do you think this?
That's a great question. And yes, I mean, if you're asking me personally, I think disobedience is necessary for all women. Like,
Mm.
there is just no women or femme or non-binary person on the planet who can live freely and not be somewhat disobedient.
Mm.
Um, because the obedience, the goodness that we have created around the structure of quote unquote woman
Mm.
is so unbearably rigid that that I don't know of a single person who identifies as a woman who feels that they can be free in that
Mm.
structure. So yes, I would say that if you are looking for freedom, then disobedience is a requirement if you live in a female body.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so, in your own case, like, what would you say was the biggest act of rebellion or disobedience?
Um, I think that for me, again, I think that people want brown women to answer that question with answers like, well, I married who I wanted to, or I did the career I wanted to. Again, like just following into those traps of, my parents dislike my partner because of their race or gender, or my parents dislike my career because of how
Mm.
successful I am in it. Um, those are the two things that essentially white supremacy tells us is the matter
Mm.
with brown women, right? And so those are the two things. When somebody asks a question like that, almost always they are expecting a
Mm.
brown woman to say, well, I did it my way. And I think that while there is an element of truth to that, and many of the essays in the book contend with that, I think that for me, the much greater truth of my life and the great sort of triumph of my life, and I can say this now in my sort of later 30s, in a way that I couldn't have said it in my earlier 20s, which is when I started the book, um, I think has just been to find joy. I
Mm.
think that as a female person, I have trained myself to find joy. And that is, and I'm not very good at it, and I can't always do it, and I can't promise I can do it every day. But to find joy, living in a brown female body in a white supremacist society
Mm.
means I have had to train myself to look for it, and sometimes I have had to train myself to be disobedient in order to have it. Now that
Mhm.
goes against every grain in my body. It goes against everything I was raised with. It goes against everything that the media has told me I should be. But
mm.
I think that even if not on a daily basis, then on a regular basis, I thwart those expectations to try to find joy.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, they say, the biggest act of revenge is to live a good life, isn't it?
Right,
So,
right, exactly, exactly.
yeah, so it makes total sense that that would be the way to go. And
Mm.
actually, there was one story in particular that really sort of struck a chord in a different way, which was
Yeah.
it was a Surya Kundu story about the
Mm,
mythology aspect,
mm, mm,
which was fantastic because obviously, from our perspective, we sort of are brought up with a lot of these stories, and it was
sure.
the story of you know where she says that Indian daughters everywhere are asked to be Sita, and they're
Mm,
told to respect and revere strength and expected to fear the unfamiliar. We pray one way but practice another. Even though
mm,
we like celebrate very powerful goddesses like
mhm.
Durga and
Yeah.
Kali, do you think that's, is there an element of truth in that at all, that we're expected to be like Sita, a bit like, a lot of white women are expected to be like Mary,
Mm,
Virgin Mary and,
mm.
Mary Magdalene, this sort of binary.
Certainly, I mean, I think in the Hindu tradition that's true. I can't speak to Islamist traditions or Jain traditions or Buddhist traditions, or although I suspect that again, being female, there is an element of this that is true in every great world religion.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, if we're speaking specifically of the Hindu tradition, in which Surya in her essay is, certainly there's an element of, and again, like this again goes back. The reason why I reject all definitions of goodness is because they are born of these very toxic places, right?
Hmm.
All definitions of female goodness are born. Sometimes they're in religion, sometimes they're just in sort
Yeah,
of popular culture, sometimes they're in all these other places. But in
definitely.
any sort of world religion, there is a definition of goddessliness, um, that is, again, I find really reductive and restrictive to
Hmm.
female bodies.
Completely, completely, and I totally sort of equate that, parallel that
Mhm.
with the Mary Magdalene, Virgin Mary
Absolutely, and
dichotomy. Mm.
if we're going to get deeper into it, there are complicating factors here. There are certain Hindu traditions, which are not based in upper caste traditions,
Mm.
that celebrate, sort of, a very different kind of female, a much more disobedient female,
Mm.
and I personally would probably lean more towards those practices if we're
Yeah.
talking about Hinduism specifically. But again, like I think that's going a few levels deeper. I would say that if we're keeping it at a sort of larger scale, then, um, definitions of goodness, especially within religion, are really often toxic to women.
Definitely. I've definitely found that myself, like, which is why I've always kind of shied away a little bit from sort of the
Right.
religious aspects of it because I've always found them quite patriarchal generally. But would you say there is an area of a South Asian, a South Asian woman's life that is scrutinized more than any other area?
Oh, which area isn't? I mean, I would say that I think that, one of the things that my students and I talk about a lot is this idea that, and again, I'll keep this in the South Asian American context because it's the one that I know the best. But in the context of South Asian America, I would say that one of the things that I've seen in recent years in my own students is that my female students have just as much career ambition as my male students do, which is extraordinary. That's wonderful. I'm so happy to see it. I couldn't be more thrilled. But what this means down the line is that we are now expecting women to be just as much the breadwinners of their family as men are, and we are still expecting them to be the purveyors of cultural and religious and moral tradition. This means that women are the bearers of language, women are the bearers of food, women are the bearers of respect, women are the bearers of religion, women are the bearers of tradition. These are not items that are expected of men. They are
Mm.
only expected of women. And now women are meant to be as successful as men in the professional arena as well, which is wonderful. That's what we wanted. We wanted that. But what we don't want is to be expected to carry the weight of all cultural burden in addition to career, which we are still.
Yeah, no, definitely. And there's something I think I read in one of the stories as well, where she was saying how much she wanted to just be with her newborn baby.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, she was kind of being forced to be a breadwinner in that
Mm-hmm.
case. And so, yeah, it's just having too much, too
Yeah.
many, too much. This is not like equality anymore, really.
Right. Right.
um,
Right. And
yeah,
that's a really complicated conversation, right? Because the answer to that is not, well, send your husband to work and stay home with your baby. Like that's there is no good answer to this question yet in our society.
no. And actually, and that leads me on to sort of the final question, which is, do you think anything has changed and will it change with new generations?
Oh man, what a question.
I know it's been 10 years since we last spoke, so I was just wondering.
No, I mean it's in some ways, look, we can't deny that there are certain rights that women have, etc. Now that were not true earlier. Hopefully, we get even further into rights for people who identify as women who were not born as women, people who identify as women who don't feel like they outwardly resemble what a good woman is supposed to look like. All of those things. We want more women's rights, not just for women, but for non-binary and trans women. All of those things, but in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We are having this discussion about what is a good woman today. We could have had it a century ago. We could have had it 2 centuries ago. And we will likely have the same conversation 1 century from now. And that is really depressing. And it's also one of the reasons why we fight. It's one of the reasons why we write. And in some ways, at least for me, I don't know how else to bring the fight to the world other than through words, and that's how I do it. And I think for me, that's why books, that's why writing, that's why literature, that's why essays, that's why stories, that's why this.
So, will there be a follow-up best anthology then for this?
Oh God, not by me. My advice is never curate an anthology, never try to create an anthology. Just don't do it. It's an extraordinary and burdensome amount of work. Um,
This
but
is
yes,
what
of
I've
course.
heard.
But of course, it's extremely satisfying if and when it does come together, and it's beautiful to see it come together in the way that this particular anthology has. And I'm so grateful for it. And I'm so grateful for the community that has given to it and supported it. And mostly to the women who have written for it. They gave their whole hearts to it. And I'm so grateful to them. But, and really to the readers who have just given so much time, energy, effort, so much of themselves in engaging with the pieces that these other people wrote. It's extraordinary to me. But dear God, I will not be doing this again. I hope
Hilarious.
somebody else takes up the mantle. Good luck. Good job.
Oh God, yeah. No, but bravo for compiling it in the first place. At least you've started the trend, so that's
I hope
important. Yeah, for sure.
so.
So
Yeah. Yeah, and I
yeah,
know I'll always be writing. I'll always keep writing. And I hope somebody else decides to do another anthology. That would be great.
yeah. So anyone out there wants to write an anthology, you've heard it here. Yes, yeah. No, huge thanks, Piyali. I really appreciate you being here and chatting to me and just sharing all your wonderful insight. Always really interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so wonderful. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you so much.